August 1945. A dust-choked truck rolled to a stop outside a Texas farm. 6 women in gray prison uniforms stepped down into the blazing heat, their hands shaking, their stomachs empty. They were German POWs, enemy soldiers, and they had been taught that Americans were ruthless, that mercy was a lie told by the victors. But then they saw it. A long table under the oak trees, platters of pulled pork, cornbread, sweet tea. The smell hit them like a memory they'd never had. May Braddock, the widow who lost her only son to German bullets in Normandy, stood on the porch. She didn't smile. She just said, "Eat. You work at dawn." It was the first kindness they'd known in months, and it came from the woman who had every reason to hate them most. But if you want to hear more incredible untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how far these stories travel. The truck's engine coughed twice before dying completely, leaving only the hum of cicadas and the weight of August heat pressing down on everything. Elsa Hoffman stood in the truck bed, her legs refusing to move. She had learned not to trust open doors. In the camps, open doors meant interrogations. In the field hospitals, they meant another dying boy she couldn't save. And now, standing in the back of an American military transport with 5 other women in threadbare prison uniforms, an open tailgate meant something she couldn't yet name. The farm spread out before them like a painting from a life she'd never lived. Live oak trees with branches that swept the ground. A white farmhouse with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Chicken coops and a barn that leaned slightly to the left, as if tired from decades of standing. And that table. That impossible table under the shade of the oaks, laid out with food that made Elsa's stomach clench with something between hunger and fear. She had been a nurse once. She knew what starvation did to the body, how it made you see things that weren't there. But Liesel Vogel, standing beside her, whispered in German, her voice small and confused. "Do you smell that? It smells like food. Real food." The guard, a young corporal with sunburned ears and an apologetic expression, gestured for them to climb down. "Come on now, don't make this harder than it needs to be." His voice was gentle, which made it worse somehow. Gentleness was always the prelude to cruelty. They had learned that in Leipzig, in Strasbourg, in every place where kindness appeared before the blow. Elsa went first because someone had to. She had always gone first. Her boots hit the Texas dirt with a soft thud, and the heat rose up through the soles like something alive. The other women followed. Greta, who had organized postal routes for the Wehrmacht and now organized nothing but her own breathing. Annalisa, who hummed under her breath to keep from crying. Frida, whose 3 sons were gone and whose silence was its own kind of grave. Ursula, who drew faces in the dirt with her finger when she thought no one was watching. And Margaret, who told jokes that weren't funny but kept them all from drowning. The woman on the porch didn't move. May Braddock. The name had been given to them at Camp Swift with no explanation, just an address and a warning to work hard and keep quiet. She was tall, solid, with gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a bun that looked like it had been tied the same way every morning for 30 years. Her face was weathered in the way of people who lived outdoors, and her eyes were the color of Texas sky before a storm. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there with her arms crossed, taking them in the way a farmer might assess livestock at auction. Elsa felt herself being measured and found wanting. She knew what they looked like. Skin stretched over bone, eyes too large and faces too thin, hair that had forgotten what a brush felt like. They were ghosts in gray uniforms, and this woman had every reason to turn them away. But May Braddock didn't turn them away. She nodded once, a sharp jerk of her chin toward the table. "Eat," she said. Her voice was flat, empty of warmth but also empty of hate. "You work at dawn." That was all. No speech, no rules, no explanation for why there was pulled pork glistening on a platter, why there was cornbread stacked in a basket, why there were mason jars of sweet tea sweating in the heat. Just eat. Just survive until tomorrow when the work would begin. They moved toward the table like soldiers approaching a minefield, each step careful, each breath measured. Elsa reached the bench first and sat because her legs gave her no choice. The smell was overwhelming. Wood smoke, char, spices she had no names for. Her hands shook as she reached for a piece of cornbread, half expecting it to vanish or someone to slap her fingers away. It was real, warm, crumbling slightly as she lifted it. She bit down and her body remembered what food was supposed to taste like. Not the watery soup at Camp Swift, not the moldy bread in the field hospital. Food, actual food with flavor and substance, and the promise that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't starve today. Beside her, Liesel made a sound, a laugh, small and shocked and completely involuntary. The other women stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. When had any of them last laughed? Elsa couldn't remember. Laughter belonged to a different life, one that existed before the war ate everything. She looked up at the porch. May Braddock was still standing there watching them eat with an expression Elsa couldn't read. Not satisfaction, not kindness. Something harder and more complicated, like watching a promise you didn't want to keep being fulfilled anyway. Her jaw was tight, her hands were fists at her sides, and for just a moment Elsa saw her face crack, saw something raw and terrible flash across it before the mask slammed back into place. May turned and walked into the house without a word, the screen door banging shut behind her. That night Elsa couldn't sleep. They had been given the barn, which was more shelter than they'd had in months, with clean hay and blankets that smelled like lavender. Through the gaps in the wood, she could see the farmhouse. A single light burned in an upstairs window. And then she heard it. A sound that carried across the yard in the thick summer air. Crying. Raw and broken and trying to be quiet. Elsa stood and moved to the barn door. Pushed it open just enough to see. May Braddock sat on the porch steps, her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. On the step beside her was a photograph in a frame. Even from this distance, Elsa could make out the shape of it. A young man in uniform, smiling. She understood then, this woman had lost someone, and they were here. 6 German women, alive and eating and taking up space in a world where this woman's son no longer existed. Elsa stepped back into the barn and closed the door as quietly as she could. She lay down in the hay and stared at the ceiling beams. The taste of barbecue still lingered on her tongue, sweet and smoky and impossible. She didn't understand this place. She didn't trust it. But for the first time since the war began, since she'd abandoned her post and her patience and any claim to being a good person, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. Hope was too big a word, but maybe something smaller. Maybe just the faint, terrifying possibility that she might survive this. That survival might mean something more than just breathing. The days found their rhythm the way water finds its level. Dawn came early in Texas, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if anyone had the energy to notice. May knocked on the barn door at 5:30 every morning, 3 sharp raps that meant get up, get moving, daylight's burning. By 6, they were in the cotton fields, hands learning the motion of pulling bolls from their stems without tearing the plant. By noon, their fingers bled and their backs screamed and the sun sat on their shoulders like a physical weight. But May brought water. Cold from the well, carried in a metal pail with a ladle that she passed around without comment. And at dusk, they ate together at that long table under the oaks. May never joined them. She ate on the porch or in the kitchen, always separate, always watching, but the food kept coming. Chicken and dumplings, green beans cooked with bacon, biscuits with butter and honey. Once, inexplicably, a peach cobbler that made Margaret cry into her napkin. The women ate in silence mostly, afraid that talking would break whatever spell kept this strange mercy flowing. They had learned in the camps that good treatment could be revoked as quickly as it was given, and none of them wanted to be the one whose voice reminded their captors that they were supposed to be enemies. Liesel struggled with the silence more than the others. She had been a student before the war, someone who believed that words could build bridges and explain away misunderstandings. She tried to talk to May once on a morning when the older woman was showing them how to repair a fence. "This is a beautiful farm," Liesel said in careful English. You must have worked very hard." May looked at her for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she handed Liesel a hammer and walked away. That night in the barn, Elsa found Liesel sitting on a hay bale, her arms wrapped around her knees. "She hates us," Liesel said quietly. "And maybe she should. We're German. Her son died fighting Germans. Why is she feeding us?" Elsa didn't have an answer. She had stopped trying to understand kindness years ago, when the field hospital in Leipzig ran out of morphine and she had to watch boys die screaming. Kindness was random, unreliable, and often followed by something worse. But she sat down beside Liesel anyway because that's what you did. You sat with people in their confusion and their pain, and you didn't pretend to have answers you didn't possess. Liesel kept talking, her voice taking on that desperate edge it got when she was trying to convince herself of something. "We weren't all monsters, you know. Most of us were just trying to survive, just following orders. We didn't know about the camps, about what was really happening. The newspaper said we were defending our homeland, that the Allies wanted to destroy us. How were we supposed to know the truth?" Elsa turned to look at her. "I knew," she said simply. "I saw what happened to the patients who weren't considered worth saving. I saw which soldiers got treatment first and which ones were left to die based on their last names or where they came from." "You didn't want to know, Liesel. That's different from not knowing." Liesel flinched as if she'd been slapped. Her face crumpled and reformed, trying to hold on to the version of herself she'd built over years of propaganda and selective blindness. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I was just a student. I believed what I was taught." "I know," Elsa said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a deep weariness. "We all did, until we couldn't anymore." The conversation ended there because neither of them had the strength to carry it further. But something had shifted. Liesel didn't sleep that night. Elsa could hear her tossing in the hay, fighting with ghosts that had her father's voice and her mother's face and the words of every professor who had told her that Germany was right, that their cause was just, that history would vindicate them. The kindnesses kept accumulating despite the silence. May taught them to pick cotton efficiently, showing them how to position their hands to spare their fingers, how to read the plants to know which bowls were ready and which needed another day. A neighbor, an older woman with kind eyes and a basket of mending supplies, stopped by one afternoon. She spoke to May in low tones on the porch, then left the basket by the barn door. Inside were needles, thread, scissors, and scraps of fabric in colors that weren't gray. The women spent that evening repairing their uniforms, reinforcing seams that had given up months ago, adding small patches where the fabric had worn through. It wasn't much, but it was something that belonged to them, something they had made better with their own hands. The Red Cross letters arrived on a Thursday. May brought them to the table at lunch, a stack of thin envelopes with foreign postmarks and official stamps. She set them down without ceremony and walked back to the house. The women stared at the letters like they might explode. News from home. News from a place that wasn't home anymore, that might not even exist in any recognizable form. Greta opened hers first. Her husband was alive, in a displaced persons camp near Munich. She read the letter 3 times, her lips moving silently, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket. Annaliese's mother had survived the bombing of Hamburg. Frida didn't open hers. She just held it in her lap and stared at the handwriting on the envelope, at a name she must have recognized, and after a while she started to hum. It was the saddest sound Elsa had ever heard. That evening, as the sun turned the sky orange and purple, an old pickup truck rattled up the drive. A man climbed out slowly, favoring his left leg. He was ancient, probably in his 70s, with white hair and weathered brown skin and eyes that had seen too much, and somehow still had room for gentleness. He pulled a fiddle case from the truck bed and nodded to May, who nodded back. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Thurman Howell, they would learn his name later, sat on the porch steps and began to play. The first song was slow and mournful, something that sounded like a hymn or maybe a lullaby. It wrapped around them like a blanket, like permission to feel things they'd been holding back. Then he switched to something lighter, a folk tune with a bouncing rhythm that made your feet want to move even when your body was exhausted. And then something impossible happened. Liesl started to hum, just quietly at first under her breath. But the melody was familiar. She knew this song. Different words, different context, but the same basic tune. A song that existed on both sides of the ocean, that belonged to farmers and soldiers and people who had never met but shared something human underneath all the borders and uniforms and propaganda. For 1 hour, sitting at that table under the darkening sky, they weren't Germans and Americans. They weren't prisoners and guards. They were just people who had survived a war and were trying to remember what peace felt like. May stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, her arms crossed, her face softer than Elsa had ever seen it. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. And that somehow felt like the beginning of something none of them had words for yet. The trucks came on a Saturday afternoon when the heat was at its worst and everyone's guard was down. 3 of them kicking up dust on the county road, their engines loud enough to be heard from the cotton fields. Elsa looked up from her work, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop. She knew that sound. Angry men in vehicles always meant trouble. It was universal, transcending language and borders and uniforms. May was closer to the house. She straightened from the tomato plants she'd been staking and watched the trucks approach with the stillness of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and didn't like any of them. The women in the field stopped picking. Greta reached for Ursula's hand without thinking. Annalise's humming cut off mid-note. The truck stopped in front of the house and men piled out. 7 of them, maybe 8. Local men judging by their clothes and their sunburned faces and the way they moved with the confidence of people who believed this land belonged to them and everyone on it answered to their judgment. The one in front was tall and thick through the shoulders, with gray in his beard and eyes that burned with something that looked like righteousness, but was really just pain that had nowhere else to go. Dale Pritchard, May's brother-in-law. Elsa knew without being told. She had seen enough family resemblances in the hospital, enough relatives who came to collect bodies or demand answers or rage at doctors who couldn't save what was already lost. This man had May's jawline and the same way of holding his shoulders, but where May's anger was quiet and turned inward, his was loud and looking for a target. "May," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to talk." May walked toward him slowly, deliberately, like she was approaching a skittish horse or a rattlesnake. She didn't look back at the women in the field, but Elsa saw her hands curl into fists at her sides. "Dale, what brings you out here?" "You know damn well what brings me out here." He gestured toward the fields, toward the women who stood frozen among the cotton plants. "We heard you got Nazis working your farm, eating at your table, sleeping in Jimmy's barn." The way he said Jimmy's name was a weapon. May's face went white, then red, then settled into something harder than stone. "They're prisoners assigned by the War Relocation Authority. They work. They leave when the Army says. That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement." Dale spat into the dirt. "My nephew died at Bastogne, Frank's boy. 19 years old, blown apart by German artillery, and you're feeding them barbecue and giving them shelter under the roof my brother built." The other men murmured agreement, a low rumble of shared grief and rage that had been fermenting for months. Maybe years waiting for an excuse to boil over. "Your nephew died fighting a war," May said, and her voice was ice over deep water. "These women didn't kill him. The war did. They're German. They're the enemy. That's the same damn thing." Dale stepped closer, and Elsa saw May hold her ground even though her hands were shaking. "You think Jimmy would want this? You think he'd want you betraying his memory by playing nursemaid to the people who killed him?" The words hit like bullets. Elsa saw May's face crumple, saw every wall she'd built to protect herself crack and splinter. May opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She just stood there, stripped bare in front of these men who she'd probably known her whole life, who'd been at her wedding and her son's funeral and every church service in between. Dale pressed his advantage. "Send them away, May. Tonight. Call the authorities and tell them you can't do this anymore. Nobody would blame you. Hell, people would respect you for it. May looked at the ground. She looked at the house. She looked everywhere except at the women standing in her field. And then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the farmhouse. The screen door opened and closed. She disappeared inside, and the silence that followed was worse than any shouting. Dale looked satisfied. He turned to his men. "Let's go. Give her some time to come to her senses." They climbed back into their trucks and drove away, leaving nothing but dust and the smell of diesel and the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Elsa and the other women walked slowly back to the barn. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They had always known this was temporary, that kindness was a luxury that could be withdrawn the moment it became inconvenient. That evening, May left their dinner on the porch. Cold cornbread and leftover beans in a pot. No meat, no tea, just the minimum required to keep them alive and working. The next morning, May didn't knock on the barn door. She didn't come to the fields. The women worked without supervision, picking cotton in silence, their movements mechanical and joyless. At lunch, they found sandwiches wrapped in brown paper sitting on the table. At dinner, more leftovers on the porch. May stayed in the house with the curtains drawn. 3 days passed like this. 3 days of meals delivered like an obligation, of work done without instruction or acknowledgement, of May's absence pressing down on everything like a physical weight. Elsa found herself looking toward the house constantly, watching for movement, for any sign that the woman who had fed them and taught them and almost smiled while listening to Thurman's fiddle still existed somewhere inside those walls. On the 4th day, Elsa woke to the sound of crying. Not quiet crying, not the muffled sobs they'd all learned to hide in the darkness. This was raw and broken and coming from the barn. She sat up and saw Liesel on the floor, clutching a piece of paper, her whole body shaking. The other women gathered around. Greta knelt beside Liesel and gently took the letter from her hands. She read it quickly, her face falling, and then she looked at Elsa and shook her head. The Red Cross had sent more information. Liesel's father was dead, executed by Soviet forces for collaboration with the occupying Germans. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. He had been a linguist, a professor, someone who taught students about German culture and history, and he had died because someone decided that made him guilty. Liesel looked up at Elsa with eyes that had lost their last bit of light. "I believed them," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I believed everything they told us, that we were right, that we were defending civilization, that the Allies were the real enemy. My father taught me those things. He believed them too, and now he's dead and it was all lies. Everything was lies." The words hung in the air like smoke. Everything was lies. The propaganda, the promises, the vision of Germany they'd been sold and had bought completely, because what else were they supposed to do? You believed what your teachers taught and your newspapers printed and your leaders proclaimed, because the alternative was admitting that your entire world was built on rot. Elsa didn't have words of comfort. She had used up her store of comforting words in the field hospital, spending them on boys who died anyway. But she sat beside Liesel and put an arm around her shoulders and let her cry. They all did. Even Frida, who never cried, who had buried 3 sons without shedding a tear, reached out and touched Liesel's hair with fingers that trembled. And that's when the barn door opened. May stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun, her face in shadow. She stood there for a long moment just looking at them, at Liesel crumpled on the floor, at the other women gathered around her, at the evidence of pain that transcended language and nationality and which side of the war you'd been on. Then May walked forward and sat down on the barn floor beside Liesel. She didn't touch her, didn't speak. She just sat there in the hay and the dust. This woman who had lost her son and had every reason to walk away, and she chose to stay. The silence in the barn stretched out like a living thing, breathing with them, holding space for grief that was too big for words. May sat with her back against a support beam, her knees drawn up, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, less solid than she had seemed before. Liesel's sobs had quieted to hiccups and shuddering breaths, but her face was still buried in her hands, Her whole body curled in on itself like she was trying to disappear. Finally, May spoke. Her voice was rough, like she'd forgotten how to use it properly. "My son wanted to be a teacher. Did I ever tell you that?" She wasn't looking at any of them in particular, just staring at the barn wall, where morning light slanted through the gaps in the wood. He was good with kids, patient, could explain things in a way that made sense. He enlisted in '42, right after Pearl Harbor, because that's what boys did. That's what was expected. I tried to talk him out of it. Told him he was needed here, that the farm couldn't run without him, but he said some things were more important than cotton. Elsa felt her chest tighten. She knew where this story ended. They all did. But May needed to tell it, needed to put it into words that existed outside her own head, and so they listened. He died on June 7, 1944, Normandy Beach. The telegram came 3 weeks later. They sent his things home in a box, his watch, his wallet, a letter he'd started writing to me that he never finished. May's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I spent 2 years hating every German alive, every single one. I used to lie awake at night imagining faces, imagining the person who pulled the trigger or launched the shell or gave the order. I wanted names. I wanted someone to blame." She turned to look at them then, really look at them, and Elsa saw something in her eyes that was beyond anger or grief. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of carrying hate for so long that it had become part of your skeleton. "And then the army sent you here. 6 German women, prisoners, and I thought, good. Let them work themselves to death in my fields. Let them suffer the way Jimmy suffered, the way I suffer every single day." Liesel lifted her head. Her face was blotchy and swollen, her eyes red. "Then why did you feed us?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you give us blankets and teach us and why are you sitting here now?" May was quiet for a long time. When she finally answered, the words came slowly, like she was discovering them as she spoke. "Because I watched you. That first day when you got off the truck, you were terrified, shaking. I could see it, and then you ate like you hadn't seen real food in months, and Liesel, you laughed. You laughed at the taste of cornbread, and I realized you weren't monsters. You were just people. Tired, scared people who'd survived something terrible and were trying to survive whatever came next." She rubbed her face with both hands, a gesture of defeat or maybe just profound weariness. "I kept waiting to hate you. Kept waiting for you to do something that would prove I was right, that you deserved everything the war had done to you. But you just worked. You didn't complain. You were grateful for scraps. And I couldn't make it fit anymore, the story I'd been telling myself about who killed my boy." "We did kill him," Elsa said quietly. "Maybe not us specifically, but people like us. People who wore the same uniform, who fought for the same country. That's true. You're not wrong about that." May looked at her and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a refusal to pretend that the past could be erased or explained away. "I know," May said. "But here's the thing I've been figuring out. Jimmy died fighting a war. He didn't die because 6 women in a prison camp existed. He died because countries sent millions of people to kill each other over borders and ideologies and things that seemed important enough to destroy the world over. And if I keep hating you, if I let that hate eat me alive, then the war never ends. It just keeps going inside me until there's nothing left but ash." Liesel was crying again, but differently now, quieter. She looked at May with something like wonder. "I believed them when they said we were right. I believed we were defending our homeland, that the Allies wanted to destroy us. My father taught me that. My professors taught me that, and I never questioned it because questioning would have meant admitting that everything I knew was built on sand." She wiped her face with her sleeve. "But I was wrong. We were wrong. And my father died still believing the lies, and I can't even tell him I'm sorry. I can't tell him that I finally see it." May shifted closer, still not touching Liesel but closing the distance between them. "My boy died believing he was doing the right thing, stopping tyranny, protecting freedom. Maybe he was right, maybe he wasn't. But he's gone either way, and I'm here and you're here, and we have to figure out how to live with what we've done and what's been done to us." The other women had gathered closer during the conversation, drawn in by the raw honesty of it. Greta spoke, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. In the camps, after we were arrested, the guards told us we deserved whatever happened to us, that we were animals who'd tried to conquer the world. Some of them were kind anyway. Some brought extra food or looked the other way when we broke small rules. I never understood it. Why show mercy to people you were taught to hate? Because mercy is the only thing that breaks the cycle, May said. Revenge just creates more revenge, more pain, more dead boys who wanted to be teachers. She stood up slowly, her joints creaking. I'm not saying I forgive everything. I'm not saying the war didn't happen or that it doesn't matter, but I'm saying that you're here now, on my farm, and you're human beings who've lost everything just like I've lost everything. And maybe the only way any of us survive this is if we choose to see each other. Really see each other. Not as symbols or enemies, but as people trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. She looked around at all of them, her eyes landing on each face in turn. Jimmy would have wanted me to see that. He was a good kid. A kind kid. He would have hated knowing that his death turned me into something hard and bitter. So I'm trying. That's all I can do. I'm trying to be the kind of person he would have been proud of. Liesl stood up unsteady on her feet and did something none of them expected. She stepped forward and hugged May, just wrapped her arms around this woman who had every reason to push her away and held on. May stiffened at first, her arms at her sides, her body rigid with surprise or discomfort or the sheer strangeness of being embraced by someone she'd been trying not to hate. But then, slowly, her hands came up and rested on Liesl's back. Not quite a hug returned, but not rejection either. Just acceptance. Just two women who'd lost everything, holding each other up in a barn in Texas while the morning sun climbed higher and the world outside continued its slow, painful work of rebuilding itself from ruins. When they finally pulled apart, May cleared her throat roughly. Well, we've got cotton to pick, and tonight I'll make something better than cold cornbread. You've earned that much. She walked toward the barn door, then paused and looked back. And Liesl, I'm sorry about your father. Whatever he believed, whatever he did, I'm sorry you lost him. Liesl nodded, unable to speak. May left, and the women sat in silence for a few more minutes, letting everything settle. Then, one by one, they stood and walked out into the fields, ready to work, ready to endure, ready to try. The notice came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same young corporal who had brought them to the farm 3 months earlier. May took the envelope from him on the porch, her face unreadable, and didn't open it until he'd driven away. When she walked to the barn that evening, the paper was folded in her pocket, and her eyes were rimmed with red. You're leaving in 3 weeks, she said without preamble. Repatriation orders. There's a ship leaving from New York in early October. They'll take you back to Germany. She didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. They all understood what going back meant. A country in ruins. Cities bombed into rubble, families scattered or dead, the Soviets occupying the East, the Allies trying to rebuild the West, and somewhere in that chaos, they were expected to find a place to exist. That night, Elsa lay awake and tried to imagine it, walking through Leipzig again, if Leipzig even existed anymore, looking for the hospital where she'd worked, the apartment where she'd lived, the people she'd known. But every image in her mind came up empty, like trying to remember a dream that had already faded. She had no idea if her mother was alive. Her brother had been drafted in '43, and she'd never heard from him again. The Germany she'd left behind was gone, and the one waiting for her was a stranger. Liesl's grief was quieter but deeper. She had no home to return to. Her father was dead. Her mother had died in the Dresden bombing. The university where she'd studied was destroyed. She told Elsa one evening, sitting on the porch steps after dinner, that she felt like a ghost being sent to haunt ruins. What do I do there? Who am I without everything I used to be? Elsa didn't have an answer. None of them did. They had survived the war only to discover that survival was its own kind of punishment, forcing you to keep living when everything that gave life meaning had been taken away. But May kept moving forward because that's what farmers did. You planted even when you weren't sure there'd be a harvest. You fed the animals even when you were exhausted. You fixed what was broken because leaving it broken wasn't an option. She started asking the women for help with small projects around the farm. Elsa helped her sort through Jimmy's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was painful work, touching a dead boy's shirts and books and childhood drawings, but May seemed to need a witness, someone to acknowledge that these things had mattered. When May pulled out a pair of work gloves, heavy leather worn soft from use, she held them for a long moment before handing them to Elsa. These were his, but they're better than what you've got. Take them. Elsa wanted to refuse. It felt wrong accepting something that had belonged to May's son, but May's face made it clear this wasn't a request. It was something else, a passing on, a way of letting Jimmy's things continue to be useful instead of becoming shrine objects in a locked room. Elsa took the gloves and wore them the next day in the fields, and they fit better than anything she'd worn in years. Liesl spent her afternoons helping May with a project Jimmy had started and never finished. The porch railing was loose, half the spindles rotted through, and May had the lumber but not the strength to do it alone. Together they measured and cut and hammered, Liesl's academic precision meeting May's practical know-how. They didn't talk much while they worked, but the silence was comfortable now, the kind of quiet that exists between people who don't need words to understand each other. The other women decided to plant a garden. It was Greta's idea. "We'll never see it grow," she said, "but someone will. And maybe that's enough." They chose a spot near the barn where the soil was good and the morning sun hit just right. May donated seeds she'd been saving, tomatoes and beans and squash and herbs. They worked the soil with their hands, breaking up clods and pulling rocks, making neat rows that looked like hope translated into earth and water and time. Annalisa sang while they planted, old folk songs that everyone seemed to know in one version or another. Ursula drew a small map of the garden layout in the dirt, labeling each row with a stick. Frida, who rarely spoke, knelt beside the bean seeds and whispered something to them before covering them with soil. It might have been a prayer. It might have been a goodbye. Either way, it was holy. May watched from the porch and felt something shift in her chest. These women were leaving soon, back to a Germany that might not want them, that might punish them for surviving when so many hadn't. They had no guarantees, no safety net, no promises that tomorrow would be anything but harder than today. And they were planting vegetables they'd never harvest. It was the most absurd, beautiful, defiant act of faith May had ever witnessed. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave, May made an announcement at dinner. "We're having a barbecue, a real one, Saturday night. I've invited some neighbors, people who've come around." She didn't elaborate, but Elsa understood. People who'd softened their hearts enough to see 6 German women as something other than the enemy. It wouldn't be everyone. Dale probably wouldn't come, but Thurman would be there with his fiddle, and a few others who'd stopped by over the weeks with donated clothes or books or just quiet nods of acknowledgement. The women spent Friday cleaning everything, polishing the farm until it shone. May spent Saturday morning at the smokehouse, working the same magic she'd worked that first day when 6 terrified women had stepped off a truck and smelled something that reminded them they were still alive. By evening, the long table under the oaks was covered with food. Pulled pork that fell apart at the touch. Coleslaw bright with vinegar and pepper. Cornbread and pickles and potato salad and sweet tea so cold it made your teeth ache. Neighbors began arriving as the sun dropped low. Thurman came first, his fiddle case under his arm, his eyes kind and knowing. A few families from May's church, an older couple who ran the general store. Even the corporal who delivered them showed up, out of uniform, looking nervous but genuine. Dale didn't come. His absence was noted but not discussed. Some wounds needed more time. Thurman played while they ate, the same songs as before. The ones that existed on both sides of the ocean, melodies that belonged to everyone and no one. People talked quietly, the conversation careful at first, but gradually loosening as food and music did their work. An older woman asked Greta about her husband, and Greta told her about the letter she'd received, how he was alive but lost, how they were trying to find each other in the rubble of a broken continent. The woman listened and nodded and said, "I hope you find him. I truly do." As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, May stood. The conversation quieted. She looked at the faces gathered around her table. German and American, young and old, all of them marked by a war that had taken more than it left. "I want to say something," she began, her voice steadier than Elsa expected. "I lost my boy. I'll never get him back. Nothing can change that. But these women didn't take him from me. The war did. And if we keep hating each other, if we keep seeing enemies instead of people, then the war never really ends. It just moves into our hearts and sets up camp there." She paused, looking specifically at the women who'd worked her farm, who'd eaten at her table, who'd slowly become something more than prisoners or enemies or symbols. These women worked hard. They never complained. They gave more than I had any right to ask. And tomorrow they're leaving, going back to a place that's probably worse than anything they survived here. The least I can do is send them off knowing that mercy isn't weakness, that kindness isn't betrayal, that maybe, just maybe, we can choose something better than what the war tried to make us. Thurman raised his glass, sweet tea catching lantern light. "Two-piece," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen war twice and chosen gentleness anyway. "However hard it is, however long it takes." The gathering echoed him. To peace. The words hung in the air like a promise or a prayer, and for one fragile evening under the Texas stars, it felt possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And sometimes, Elsa thought, possible is enough to keep you moving forward,